as a classification anymore, but it's just a general concept of a particular group of fish. All right, what is an Ostracodere? Well, they're all extinct. They're important because they are some of the oldest, if not the oldest, vertebrates going back into the fossil record. And they're interesting because the name, the OSTRA, means shell, and the derm, of course, means skin. These animals were characterized by having an outer shell or an outer skeleton of bone. So an exoskeleton made from bone. And it's the primary reason why we consider these animals vertebrates, is because they had bone. We'll talk about bone in a minute. Bone is a very vertebrate characteristic. Right? No vertebrae have ever been found for ostracoderms, but they're considered vertebrates because they had bone. Now, it's an exoskeleton surrounding the animal, but it is covered by skin. Bone forms in the dermis. There we go. Do we know what dermis is? You have two layers of skin, epidermis and dermis. Epidermis is the outer, dermis is the inner. Vertebrates have the ability to form bone in the dermis. So when we say it's an exoskeleton, keep in mind that it was covered with skin on the outside. It's not like a clam where you can go up and knock, knock, and you're hitting the hard stuff right away. No, it was bone in the dermis of the skin covered over by the epidermis. The bones were bony plates. They could be very large, they could be very small, almost like scales. These animals had no paired appendages, so no right and left. Some of them did have, and we'll point out some drawings of them in a minute, paddle-like extensions. But these were just bony extensions coming out from that exoskeleton. They couldn't be moved. They weren't flexible appendages. They were just parts of the skeleton that stuck out. No paired appendages, no jaws, no teeth. And most were very small. All right, how small is small? All right, if you go past that handout that you were looking at, you come to another one that's labeled number 1. Okay, the handouts from lab. Lecture, not lab. That's lab. That's lab. Turn the page. There you go. Turn one page. There you go. All right, so that's just a drawing of some representative ostracoderms to give you a feel for these animals. So if you look at them going down, you can see that generally there are no paired appendages. They do indicate that one had a pectoral fin, but they really should put that in quotation marks because it is not a movable appendage. Instead, it is just a bony extension from the exoskeleton of the animal. I mentioned that they had different sizes of bony plates. And you can see the one on the top has quite large ones, and the one in the middle, the third one down, C, they're very small plates all over the animal. Right? You sort of can get the feel maybe that there are no jaws, and you'll have to trust me that there are no teeth that are in there. So these are very, very ancient vertebrates, some of the first vertebrates ever. Even though they had no vertebrae, we do consider them to be vertebrates, primarily because they have bone. So that means I want to go into a little side spiel on bone for a minute. So this is considered a true vertebrate characteristic, not found in any other group of animals. Well, what is bone? We can use the word bone in different ways. And one is, you refer to your humerus or your femur, and so you're referring to a specific structure that we call a bone. But in general, bone is a mineral. It's a particular kind of mineral that forms hard tissues in vertebrates. That mineral is called hydroxyapatite. So your humerus, your femur, every one of your bones is made up of the substance called bone, which is a mineral called hydroxyapatite. That's the hard stuff in your bones. And it's kind of interesting because its composition differs from the skeletal material of all other vertebrates. So, in my comparative anatomy, who knows? What are the two major constituents of hydroxyapatite?
Calcium phosphate.
Calcium and phosphate. Right? So, it's got a very long chemical formula. The important thing is that it does have calcium in it, and it is dominated by phosphate as well. So, it's a calcium phosphate mineral, as opposed to what do mollusks use? What do echinoderms use for their skeleton? Oh, go back to 120. That's arthropods. Yep. Calcium. Carbonate. Calcium carbonate. Okay? So, that's the interesting thing, is that vertebrates adopted a calcium phosphate skeleton. Nobody else ever adopted a calcium phosphate skeleton. Everybody else was using calcium carbonate, right? Think of all those little creatures. That's primarily what they're using. Yeah, you can get some rotifers with some silicon in there, but anyway, they didn't adopt calcium phosphate. So that, again, we're just sort of digressing a minute here. That makes it interesting as to why bone was adopted. What could be the selective advantage of getting a skeleton of hydroxyapatite containing calcium and phosphate? What would be the advantage over that instead of using the time-old trick of using calcium carbonate? Well, there are a number of hypotheses as to why bone evolved. Many of them do not specifically pertain to why calcium phosphate over calcium carbonate. Some of them will just tell you, well, this is an advantage of having a skeleton, and it's true. So, for example, and undoubtedly this was true for the ostracoderms. Their skeleton, advantage of having the skeleton was armor. It was protection from predators. Right? But it doesn't address the question of why calcium phosphate versus calcium carbonate, and maybe it was just an accident. There's another hypothesis saying that the ostracoderms developed bone for insulation. Now, it's not heat insulation. It's electrical insulation. Because many fishes, and based upon other evidence from the fossils, ostracoderms had these, they have electrode receptors. Many fish have electrode receptors. They're capable of detecting the electrical fields in the water that are set up by the contraction of the heart of another fish, or the movements of the muscles when they're moving the fins. An animal has its own electrical things going on inside. So the idea is that the skeleton evolved as a way of insulating the internal electrical fields from the external electrical fields, therefore allowing the animal to determine what was up there as opposed to inside. But that too doesn't really address calcium and phosphate versus calcium and carbonate. There's a couple of ones that do, though. A guy named Tarlow, Storage, came up with the idea that perhaps calcium and phosphate were chosen for storage reasons, storage of calcium and phosphate. And so basically he's saying, well, it's reasonable to assume that in the watery environments where these animals lived, the amount of calcium and phosphate was not constant throughout the year. And so it would behoove these animals to store calcium and phosphate in their system so that when it wasn't readily available, they could withdraw it from their skeleton and use it. I mean, calcium's essential. I mean, you can't have your muscles contract. They won't work unless you have calcium. Phosphate, it's part of ATP. If you don't have enough phosphate, you could be in big trouble. So he hypothesized that it evolved as a storehouse for these chemicals. And in reality, it matches what we see today. Vertebrates use their skeleton as a storage site for calcium and phosphate. You can see this in female mammals all the time. When they're pumping out milk for their young, the density of their bones decreases because calcium is being withdrawn from the bone, put into the milk, and then into the young. There's no way that most lactating female mammals can get enough calcium in their diet to match what's going out in the milk. And so they withdraw that calcium and phosphate from the skeleton. So we see how skeletons operate, and this idea matches what we are seeing in living vertebrates, that they will use the skeleton as a storage place for calcium and phosphate. So it's a more intriguing hypothesis. And a guy called Rubin, it's probably the most recent of the hypotheses. It's a pH hypothesis. And he's got some data from the laboratory that actually support it, but the reasoning goes like this. Most invertebrates are inactive. They just sit there all day. Think of a clam. What's a clam do all day? You know, sometimes they move, but they're really pretty inactive. Vertebrates, in contrast, it's a vertebrate characteristic. They are active animals in comparison to invertebrates. Invertebrates that have a calcium carbonate skeleton. Okay. What he demonstrated in the lab, well, before I back up, if you are active, you are going to use, on a consistent basis, anaerobic metabolism. So as I'm walking back and forth up here, yeah, most of my energy is coming from aerobic metabolism, and it is for you as you're sitting there. But as soon as you get up and walk out the door, your body's going to kick in some anaerobic metabolism. All right? You need that sudden burst of ATPs in order to get your butt out the door until your heart and lungs catch up and provide enough oxygen so that you can go back to 100% aerobic respiration. What's the waste product of anaerobic? Lactic acid, lactate. Okay? His data from the lab shows that calcium carbonate is much more susceptible to breaking down if there are small shifts in pH. So mammals get small shifts in pH because of their consistent use of anaerobic metabolism. His data from the laboratory also shows that a calcium phosphate skeleton is more resistant, to that slight change in pH. So Rubin would say that a prime factor in choosing bone, hydroxyapatite, a calcium phosphate mineral, is that it allowed vertebrates to remain or to become very, very active and still have a very solid skeleton in the face of these slight shifts in pH. Right? Now his idea is not, these 3 and 4 are not mutually exclusive. Right? So we could have had evolution of bone occurring for both of those reasons combined, because they both can be beneficial. You can see how they can be beneficial. Yeah?
Why is vertebrate bone so highly vascular? You know, there's so much blood vessels in vertebrate bone versus like a clamshell. There's, you know, it doesn't bleed.
Yes, and it depends upon the type of bone. So it's all hydroxyapatite, but the way that it's constructed will differ tremendously among the